All right, good afternoon. This is David Robison with Design Master Software. We're going to be doing a training on feeders for one-line diagrams today. Be looking at how you can manipulate your feeders, the commands we have available for getting them in the right spaces, arranging them, making them look nice, just kind of the features we have for working with feeders. First thing I want to do is I've got a one line here, just some panels laid out for us to work with. If I go take a look at a feeder and I click on it, you'll notice that the feeders have a number of grips on them. So you can use these to move the feeders around. If you select the middle grips, it'll move the line kind of back and forth. It'll keep it as a straight line. If you select one of the corners, it'll move the two edges connected to that corner. So we have those grips there. There's also a grip for the feeder ID. Sometimes it ends up right on top of the other grips, so you have to kind of move things around to get to the right one, but you can move the feeder IDs. If when you're moving the feeder itself, you run into the feeder ID or any of the other graphics, we will move the graphic and do our best to relocate things, but you might need to at that point then make adjustments. If I take a look at one of these other feeders, we have also the grips for moving the overcurrent protection, both up and down on the line. The overcurrent protection also has this grip here, which is used just to flip the side of the feeder that graphic is displayed on. So if you want to adjust that, you can move it back and forth like that. On these vertical feeders, you'll notice, check and make sure this is set how I think it is. It is, all right. So there's a number of, this vertical feeder, when they first come in, they actually come in as 3 pieces. So there's a piece here at the top, a little horizontal piece that's actually 0 length, so you don't even see it, and then another piece here. So when you try and move things around, particularly like this overcurrent protection, there's a little spot there where it actually won't, it'll just kind of jump back and forth because there's another segment there, and so it can't go in the middle of it. And so if you see that happening, that's why it can't go there, because there's this extra little piece. If you move the panel, the reason we do that is so that when you move the panel and pull it over here, we have basically this extra segment to have the feeder arrange itself nicely. So if you do have a feeder, again, like this, where it is hitting that middle section, and you need to get the overcurrent protection in there, you can grab that. Typically, actually, it's probably simplest if you pull it out. You can either get rid of this if you know it's just going to be a vertical section, or pull this whole little piece down, straighten it all back up, and then you can get your overcurrent protection down a little lower. So just be aware that that's happening, that's how we do our initial generation of those feeders, and that's what you need to do to get things to move around nicely with them. And as you saw when I moved the panel, the feeders are linked to the panels so that when you move the panel, it does pull the feeder along with it. So if you move just a panel, it will pull the connected endpoint of that feeder. If I, what's a good panel? If I, for example, pull this transformer, it'll pull both the feeder feeding it and the ones leaving from it. So it'll pull the connected feeders on both sides. You can also move the feeders themselves using the standard AutoCAD MOVE command. When you do that, we will leave the start and the end points where they are and just move the rest of it. So if I pull this whole thing down here, the start and the end stayed where they were, and we pulled basically this segment and then some of the labels around as well. So just be aware that is how that command works with moving of the feeder itself. So if you want to pull the feeder and the panel, when you do that, we'll move this end and this segment, but this end back here is actually going to stay where it is. So if we pull it over here, it pulls just that horizontal piece and then the portion connected to the panel. So if you do need to move things around, you can kind of play with whether you want to move the panel or the feeder or both of them together to get things arranged how you want on your drawing. We do our best when we generate things to put the feeder in a reasonable spot. And we try and make it easy with the grips and the move command to arrange things. There are times, however, where you just want to redraw the feeder, that it's not in the right spot, and messing with the grips is going to be more work than it's worth. So we have the Redraw Feeder command. So this is the Redraw Feeder on the RT toolbar in our electrical for AutoCAD. The Redraw Feeder commands here. The commands, all the buttons are the same. The RT toolbar has the labels on there, so they're sometimes a little easy to see. So we'll pull off the RT toolbar. You run the redraw, and it will ask you to select. You can either select the feeder itself or the panel that you want to draw the feeder for. So if for some reason you're missing the feeder entirely and you say, I want to redraw the feeder for this panel, you can just select the panel, and then it'll prompt you to redraw the feeder. If you select the panel, it actually is going from the downstream to the upstream panel is the direction it'll draw from. So it'll highlight this panel saying, I'm going from here. And then it'll highlight this panel here saying, I'm going back to there to give you kind of some directionality of which way it's thinking you're going to draw this feeder. So we can draw it backward like that. And it will also prompt you for the location of the overcurrent protection. You can either locate it in a specific spot. If you press enter, it'll put it in a default spot, the best it can come up with. And then the same for the feeder ID. It'll give you a chance to locate that. Or you can press enter, and it'll put it in a default location. So if you select the feeder, you'll see that it's drawing from the upstream to the downstream. So the direction you draw, depending on what you select to begin with, down at the command line, it does give you an option to reverse that direction. If you actually wanted to draw from this panel back, you could do R for reverse, and you'll say, okay, I'm drawing from here instead. And then there's a couple other options at the command line that you should be aware of. There is the option to offset from another feeder. And so if we press O for offset, it'll ask us what feeder we want to have to start this feeder offset from. I can select this feeder here. And then it wants to know we want to be on this side or this side. I select over here. And it'll select a point at our standard feeder offset distance, which we'll look at in a moment. But it has a standard distance. It'll offset the feeder from there so you can line things up with a consistent spacing. You can then draw from that point, or you can actually do an offset again. So if we do O, if we do O, then it turns on some snaps, so that if we move close to this feeder, you can see that we actually get this snap point, the little green thing that's going to show up here. So if I move my cursor close to this feeder, it will snap to that point and be nicely offset from there. And then when I come over here, again, we have our feeders being arranged at a nice, consistent distance from each other. We're connecting to this panel here. If we do just F for finish and press enter, it'll do a nice connection to the top of that panel. It'll kind of trim everything up and get a nice connection to the default connection location there. You put those labels on there. There's one more option that it has, and that is for the first point of the feeder. There is a use default starting point. So if you press D for default, it'll choose a point on the bus bar connected to the other panel where it thinks, this is a good default spot. In this case, selecting over here, not the best choice. On the other hand, if I reversed that and I was starting from down here and I use the default point, it nicely grabs in the middle of that panel. So it can grab a nice default location for you. And so that's to help you get everything connected and, again, looking nice when you're drawing in your feeders. There's a question in the chat box. can you turn off the feeder tags? And the answer to that question is yes, you can. That is under Options. There is, in the one-line diagram section, Insert Feeder IDs inside feeder lines. The default setting for that is yes, and so it'll include those feeder tags. If you don't want them, you can change that to no, and then it will not include them. You will have to, after you do set that to no, run an update to update everything on your one-line diagram, and it'll pull those feeder IDs off. I'm going to turn them back on just so that we have them as we're doing our other commands, because most people typically have those on. But you do have the choice to include those or not include those, depending on what you like to do for labeling your feeders. In addition to redrawing the whole feeder, again, we have the grips for moving it around. There are times when you need additional points to draw your feeder to get it routed nicely. You can use these commands here. We have an add segment to middle, add segment to end, and remove segment command that will add an additional segment to the feeder. So if we add a segment to the middle, it'll ask you to select a point on the feeder. And it won't look like anything happens, though you do see some additional grips that were added. Basically, we have another segment right here. It's a little zero length piece. So now if we pull the rest of this off, we can take that piece and it's basically broken in half. And we have a horizontal segment going between those two vertical pieces on that feeder line there. There is also the add segment to end. If you run this command, select the feeder near one end or the other, and it will add another segment, as you can see, down at the end of the feeder. So if you wanted to add something to the end, you could do it that way. Pull this whole feeder, have it look something like that. And then finally, there is the remove segment, where if you want to get rid of a segment, if we select this segment here, it'll get rid of this one, and then it also has to obviously get rid of the other vertical piece and kind of square that whole thing up. So those are the commands that we have for adding and removing segments to a feeder that's already inserted on the drawing. The other next set of commands are these ones for arranging feeders that are on the drawing. We have the align command, the offset, and the swap. These take the feeders and kind of match them up nicely if they're already on the drawing so that everything looks nice. I'm going to redraw this whole thing as a riser because some of these commands are a little more useful when we're looking at a riser. At least I have some better examples to work with. So for a riser, say we take this whole section here. I'm going to move all of this down. So we've got this feeder, and obviously we don't want to be going up and down. That's looking a little silly. We can run this command to remove that segment. And now maybe instead of coming all the way over here and coming down, we actually want to match this one up so that we come over here and go down at the same spot as this one where it's going up. So we can run the align command, and when you run the align command, you select the feeder that's in a good spot. So you say, okay, we like where this segment is, and we want to match this feeder segment up with it. And it'll pull that feeder segment over. In this case, that feeder ID is having a little trouble, so we'll want to pull that to a better spot. But it'll match those up so that those are going up and down on the page in a nice vertical line there. So that's the align command. We also have the offset command, and this will take feeders that are on the drawing and offset them nicely at the specified distance that we've got for the feeders. So if we look at this whole arrangement here, and we say, you know, this piece, we want to pull the whole feeder up here because we want to have a little more space for some other notes. And now we want to have everything else lined up nicely with that feeder that we pulled up there. We can run the offset command. And here we say, okay, this segment is in a good spot. And let's choose this segment to offset from it, and then it wants to know which side we're offsetting, if we're going above it or below it. I'll select below it, and it'll match that one. It'll then prompt you to select additional segments, and it'll just kind of keep going down the line. So if you have a whole run of feeders like that, you can select them all, and it'll lay them all out nicely for you. The distance that is chosen for that offset, because it didn't actually even ask us how far away, is set in options using the feeder offset multiplier. And that's currently here set to 0.3. And that's going to be, in terms of distance, that'll be the distance on the printed page between your feeders. So that's 0.3 inches. So if you have 10th inch text, it's going to be 3 times the height of your text, basically, because it's 0.3 or 3/10. So if we want to have bigger spacing, because you want to be able to fit more notes in there, you can increase this. And then any new feeders that you insert are going to use that offset. It won't touch anything that's already on the drawing. So if you make that change, you might have to go back and make some adjustments. So it's not something you want to constantly be changing in the course of a project. You also kind of want to, figure out what your standard is going to be for your company and have it set once. But if we change that, we can run the offset command again, select that same feeder, and then select these other feeders and offset them. And they're now offset by that larger distance. We do also, during the offset command, have the option to set the distance. So you can press D at any point, and you can tell it how far apart you want the feeders. So if we specify a smaller distance like that, we can offset them at that smaller distance. So you can override it during the command if you want to. The final feeder arrangement command is the swap command. And this will take 2 feeders, the start of the feeder, and swap them. If I run the swap command here, it'll actually swap the 2 segments. So if I select this segment here and this segment here, it swaps them. It actually travels along the feeder, swapping them until it kind of gets to a point where they cross over, and then it doesn't swap them at that point. So the feeders stay connected to the same location. But now if we wanted to, then we could pull this panel over here if you wanted to rearrange things. That would be the way you can rearrange those 2 panels, so that when you swap the feeders, everything gets rearranged nicely, and then you move the panels to their new location. The 2 other commands are the insert break and the remove break. So when you have feeders that cross over each other, we don't have any shown here. I'll pull this feeder back up here. So when they cross over each other, when you run the update, we will insert the feeder breaks automatically. So we'll see that these feeders are crossing, and we'll do the breaks for you. If you make adjustments to your feeders, you'll see that those breaks do not update immediately. Because if they did, the next question you would ask is, okay, can we have that happen less frequently? Because it takes a little time to do the calculations to figure out where those breaks go. So it's better to do it just during the update command. So when we run the update, it'll update those breaks again. So in general, when feeders are crossing, we'll handle the breaks. You don't need to worry about it. There are times when you want to specify a break for some other purpose, if you want to put in some other notes there. Or very commonly, if your one-line diagram is very large and you want to spread it across multiple sheets, you can do it all in one diagram in AutoCAD, but just in different locations. I could, for example, say, hey, let's take this whole section here and let's move it way off in space. So we can have one sheet down here showing this portion of the one-line diagram, and then we could do another viewport, another XREF, where we're showing just this portion of the one-line diagram. So you could have it across 2 different sheets if it's a particularly large one-line diagram. But when you have that, you'll have these feeder lines running off the edge of your page, and that starts to look a little bit messy. And that's where the feeder break can come in, where you can insert a break, and we'll put a break in both of those. And when you put in those custom breaks, you actually get grip points, and so you can stretch this whole thing down and stretch this one up here, grab the right grip point. So you can stretch those points like that. Do the same thing with this other one here. Where'd my break go? You know, there's a little bit of drafting involved here, obviously. You can get it arranged nicely. So we have, you know, it's still connected. It still knows that this feeder is the same feeder across both these pages. You can put a little, you know, break and a note using standard AutoCAD continued on other sheet. When you update, it'll still all look nice. But that way, you're not running off the end of your page. So that's a common use for the insert break command. And then if you change your mind and you pull things back together, we have the remove break command, which appropriately enough will remove a break. So you select a point on the feeder somewhere near the break, and it'll remove the closest break that it finds. The final command we have for our feeders is the insert feeder command. This allows you to just insert a feeder on the drawing, not connected to anything else in the database, purely for drafting purposes. We don't have any way to insert just like your spare breakers and whatnot. You do have to insert those manually. This will allow you to do that. It'll be using the same set of layers and everything else. I'm going to expand this panel so I've got space for another feeder. I can then run the insert feeder command. It'll ask you for the piece of equipment you're putting the feeder on, and then it'll ask you for the graphics to be used on the feeder. If you want to have an overcurrent protection block, if you want to have a block at the start or the end of the feeder, and the layer system to be used. So we can choose whatever block that we want there. And then it works the same as the redraw command, where you've got the same options for offsetting or using the default location. Here, if I use the default location, I was hoping it would pull down off of that other one, but it's not. So I'll run that command again. And we will do it offset from this feeder. And then we can just put in another feeder here. And then, you know, you've got that feeder. You can label it however you want. If you do our insert and modify labels command, it basically has a spot for a couple labels. It doesn't have any other labels pulling from the database because we don't have this linked to anything in the database. So that's purely a drafting command. So if it's actually, you know, you have to kind of keep track of if it's labeling a spare or anything on the project. You do have to kind of manually keep that coordinated. The layering is controlled by the circuit that the feeder is on and that the feeder is representing. Within our Revit add-in, we have a simple change layer system command. If you run that, you can select the feeder and you can assign it to an existing layer. So they all come in new by default. You can swap it to existing, and that'll get you a different layer system if it's an existing feeder. In our AutoCAD-based software, we do have that same change layer system command, so you can change it there. It's also controlled by the in a couple other places as well, because it shows up in a couple other places in our AutoCAD software. If you go to the circuiting dialog, you can select the one of your panels, select the circuit, and then you can set the layer system there. So if you change it here, it will update when you update it, update the one line. So if I change this to existing, I'm not even sure which feeder that is, but when we run the update, we should get another one changing to the existing layer system. Yeah, it was this one down here. So you can make the change in the circuiting dialog if you want to do it. And if you do it there, it will update. When you put a label on the feeder, we will snap to the feeder nicely for you. So we'll put the feeder size on here. So if we're just moving around, you can place it wherever. If you get close to the snap to it, and will be nicely offset either above or below it. If you go to the vertical piece, we will snap vertically. If you don't want that, you can turn it off by pressing S for toggle snap to the feeder, either on or off. Press S, and now when you get close to the feeder line, it's not going to be snapping to it, and you can place this wherever you want to. So if you're snapping and you don't want to, just press S and it'll turn that off, and then you can locate this wherever you want. When you use grips to move the feeder, to move the labels, they're going to snap automatically. And there's no way with the grips to turn that off, just because you don't really have the option so that you do when running other commands. So if you're trying to move a label that's already in there and it's snapping and that's frustrating you, stop trying to use the grip for a moment, and we have the move label command. There you can select the label. Again, it's going to snap by default, but now you have the option to press S for snap and to turn it off. If you turn it off while it's vertical, it actually ends up vertical, so you don't always want to do that. If we turn the snap off, now it'll turn itself off nicely, so you can locate it wherever you want. So it will snap, and you can turn that snap off when you need to. You can also turn it on an option so that rather than snapping to the feeder line, it will be labels will be inserted inside the feeder line. So the option is insert labels inside feeder lines. We can change that from no to yes. And now when we move this label here, you'll see that it is snapping to the middle of the feeder line, and it breaks the feeder. Pull this ID out of the way. So you can see there, it nicely breaks the feeder with that label inside of it. And then we can pull that. If you pull it outside with the right grip, it'll just put the feeder back together and pull this label outside of the feeder. To change the graphics that are used, we have the change graphics command that allows you to turn a feeder ID on or off for a specific feeder. So if you have them turned on, but for a specific feeder, for example, this one that's an existing feeder, if we set that to no, it'll turn off the feeder ID, so we don't want to label this feeder because it's already existing and we don't want it showing up on the schedule or being labeled like that. You can do that. You can also change the overcurrent protection block. So we can set to using our default value right now. We can change it to use a different block. And then we have the block at start of feeder and block at end of feeder. For some feeders, some people have additional blocks, additional graphics, connections that are being made. And you can draw out that graphic and then add it as a block to the start or the end of the feeder. None of these blocks are really that appropriate for that purpose, but I'll throw 2 blocks on there just to show you how that works. So when you run that command, it puts those blocks on there. You can't move them. They're just always at the very start and very end. You can't flip them back and forth if they have the toggle. So you can flip the side that they're on, but they're otherwise just fixed at the start and the end. So if you have some additional graphics you want to show, you can use that command. There's a question. Can you change the sequence of the info in the feeder label? For example, put the conduit size last. We have some options for changing the format of the feeder callout. Our default is conduit size, hot wires, the neutral, and then the ground. Within options, we do have those choices if I can figure out where they are. That's not one-line diagram related because the feeder IDs show up in a lot of different spots. So bear with me while I find it. I think it's under home run and loops. So we have hot or neutral first, Actually, no, that's the, I think that's tick marks. Yeah, this is all tick marks here. Give me just a moment to figure out where these options are. We have a lot of options. I do know we have an option to move the conduit to the front and the back, and to make some other changes there as well. Here it is. It's going to be under circuit, load types, and wire sizes. Display conduit location is specifically what was being asked. So we have the option for the conduit location for the start of the wire callout or the end. So you can basically move that back and forth. So we can put that on the end of the wire callout. And then when we run the update, it'll move the conduit size to the end of the label there. Or it won't, and so we'll have to do a couple other tweaks to get it to actually update. Let me see if I can get that to update. So there it is, at least showing up at the end. And this is not the kind of setting you want to flip back and forth on in the middle of a project. You typically have a standard, and you set it at the beginning, and then everything works out fine. There's probably a couple other buttons to press, maybe run a coordinate to get everything to update. But you can't move the conduit to the end of the call out there. We were looking at the feeder graphics. So we saw you can put them at the start and the end. For the overcurrent protection, that graphic, the graphic that's used is it's pulled from various spots. It kind of starts at a more global spot, and then you can kind of, at each level, override it. So in the options, we have the default overcurrent protection block. That's down here. So the default block that's used for circuit overcurrent protection, in this case actually is currently set to none. So you could have no overcurrent protection, then override it. Or you could set it to a specific block, and it'll pull from the list of breaker blocks. Then for each panel, in the block settings, we have two overcurrent protection block values. One is for the upstream overcurrent protection, and one is for all of the circuits on the panel. So if we set the upstream, this will override whatever is set on the upstream panel, so you can set what overcurrent protection block this one's going to use, a circuit breaker or a fuse. And then you can also change what's going to be used for everything connected to the panel. And that way, for example, if we've got this switchboard and instead of these circuit breakers, we want to use fuses, we can more easily make that change. So select that switchboard, change it from this circuit breaker to a fused switch, for example. And when you run the update, it'll actually see the new blocks being used, and it'll update all of those with that different block. So that's the default block that's going to be used if it hasn't been set differently for that feeder. And then you can, for each specific feeder, set a specific block, which is where here we've specifically set that one to use this breaker with the dots, which is why that is overriding it. So we have the option to use the default or to override it with another value. So we can override it with the breaker with the dots there. And I think I have covered everything we need to look at for feeders. Are there any questions on that? I see a question. Can the software insert ground graphics? No, it can't. I looked at what people did for grounds, and it's really all over the place in terms of the documentation people do. We decided that we really couldn't come up with anything better than draft it yourself using standard AutoCAD. That's actually going to be probably the best solution. So we just left it there. We do have in some of our graphics, for example, if you take this transformer, we do have some of them that have grounds included. So you can, if you know what your grounds look like, and you include it as a part of your default graphics, you can include them that way. So that's an option that you have. But if you have more complicated grounding situations, you just draft that in using standard AutoCAD. Can the ground size be inserted as a label? We do not track that ground size, and that is something that we could and probably should and someday eventually will do, where we're keeping track of the ground size, and then we can label it for you. We don't, so that has to be inserted as a separate label right now. But that is something that we're aware of that we should do, and we just don't yet. Another question came in. We've been playing with creating custom one-line blocks, but we lose any dynamic controls when we put the blocks into Design Master. Is there a way to add stretch grips, or is there anything like that in the works? So, yeah, we don't support dynamic blocks with our one-line drafting here currently. It's not something we are actively looking at. I'm going to make a note to take a look at it for you. I don't really know what is going to be involved with that. I'm not sure how feasible that will actually be to support, just because of the underlying technology we have for everything else. Getting dynamic blocks to work with them is going to be a little bit of work. So no, we don't support it. Maybe in the future, but I wouldn't expect anything soon. Question. Will you eventually go through the process of exporting and importing one-lines into Revit? Maybe in a future session. Are you thinking about actually getting the DWG file back into Revit for publishing purposes there? Or are you thinking about going from your Revit model into AutoCAD and taking your updates from Revit and getting them into AutoCAD? And I'll actually just answer both of those. For going from Revit to AutoCAD, whether or not the DM file needs to be created, so creating the panels in Revit and then exporting to AutoCAD and then back into Revit. So you're looking for basically the whole round trip thing. We've not specifically talked about going from Revit to AutoCAD, but we could do that. I will make a note of that as a future topic. And I know we don't talk about going from AutoCAD into Revit, and that's something I've actually been doing some research so that I understand that process better. And once I understand that, I probably will do some sort of training on that as well. We do have a series of videos and tutorials on the one-line diagram that do talk about going from Revit to AutoCAD. So if you go to our website, under support articles, we have, it's just kind of like a running stream of articles, so you might have to dig back to find one. But if you go back, we have this whole section of one-line diagram articles. If you click on any of those, there's then a link to the main list of all of our one-line diagram articles. And this first link here, Create Your One-Line Model, talks about specifically going from Revit, linking things, and going into AutoCAD. So if you click there, there's basically a section on using our AutoCAD software and a section on using our Revit software. You'd want to go to Create Your One-Line Model in Revit. And here it talks about creating your panels, creating your AutoCAD project, and exporting from Revit and then importing into AutoCAD. So it walks through that whole process. It's got videos where we're showing you how it works. I'm going to copy and paste that link to the chat box there. So you can click on that. It should pull it up in your browser. You can save that for review later after the training. So that does specifically address that, not in one of these sessions, but with some of our other documentation. And then the linking from Revit back to AutoCAD, we don't have anything on that. That's just standard Revit stuff. But I do plan on doing a little more research myself on that so I understand it better so that then we can share that. Thank you for coming out for training, and we look forward to seeing you next week or next month.